thanks to Stephen and East End for the invite as always down to the city. So the topic, how the border was born, the formation of Northern Ireland. My take on the formation of Northern Ireland, which you mightn't have heard exactly the same take on it from Ian and Phoenix or BBC Radio Ulster, etc. So we'll start at the beginning, no better place. Throughout history, there were always significant differences between Ulster and the rest of the island of Ireland. A natural boundary of mountains and valleys between the northeast and the rest of the island meant that there was constantly a degree of separation between the people of both of the areas. Now, in ancient history, these geographical features were significant hurdles when travelling. We don't think much of them today, but in eras when all travel was solely by foot, the vast majority of people never strayed further than just a few miles from their birthplace. Age-old, the Gaelic myth, Gaelic legend, they actually back up this idea of the northeast being a place apart. It's littered with folklore that highlights conflicts and differences that can broadly be said to be between the regions. Such as, we all know, everybody will have heard of Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster. And there's also the Ulster cycle of ancient sagas. Now, the short distance to Scotland further added to these already strong factors, resulting in separation and difference. For millennia, Scotsmen and Ulstermen alike woke up on their respective coastlines only to see green land on the other side of the water. And ironically, crossing the Irish Sea would have been an easier journey than navigating much of the terrain on the island itself. Communities that survived via food and resources from the sea with a natural inquisitiveness and comparative ease compared to elsewhere along the Irish, Scottish and English coastlines ensured that for centuries people travelled between both of the land masses. Many that came across to stay in Ulster brought their own world perspectives and cultural traits with them and mixed and melted among the existing people. In the early 17th century, the plantation of Ulster, the movement of proportionally massive numbers of people from Scotland and Northern England in particular to live here, reinforced and cemented Ulster's difference from the rest of the island even more so. Ulster became a majority Protestant area with a very strong communal, economic and faith tie to Scotland and even to England. On the rest of the island, these links were weaker, and slowly, as time progressed, would become more and more tenuous. A series of events followed beyond plantation that each in their own way really accentuated this difference between the northeast and the rest of the island, between Ulster and the other provinces. The 1641 rebellion, which was essentially a Catholic uprising against the new Protestant community, brought to the forefront religious difference. The Williamite Wars, the Glorious Revolution, King Billy, brought political difference to the fore. And in their aftermath, the penal laws, enacted because of the belief that demonstrable evidence could be seen that Catholicism was loyal only to a foreign power, and thus individual Catholics could not be trusted, these penal laws brought to a head increasing resentment by the Catholic population of Ireland against its Protestant neighbours and their perceived English overlords. The late 1700s saw a perfect storm, resulting in the largest ever revolt seen on the island. The French Revolution, combined with the emergence of new philosophies regarding the desire for a view of progress that centred on individual liberty and the separation of church and state, influenced the birth of the initially Presbyterian-dominated United Irishmen. Catholic discontent was welcoming to the concepts raised, and agrarian movements across Ireland, such as the Defenders, enthusiastically came on board. However, this shifted the movement's focus from reform to revolution, and the outcome was the 1798 rebellion. This rebellion was quashed by a mixture of government forces and the most committed and forthright in the northeast in particular, primarily personified but not exclusively so by the 1795 Born Orange institution. That element now commonly became referred to as loyalists. In 1801, the Act of Union was passed. This was a direct outcome of the rebellion, of the 1798 rebellion, and it was an acknowledgement by Westminster that the links with Ireland must be enhanced with England to minimise potential for future dissent. This Act joined together the Kingdom of Ireland and the Kingdom of Great Britain, England, Scotland and Wales, into a larger United Kingdom under one Parliament, one government, one monarchy. Protestants all over Ireland, but especially the North East, initially were mostly oppositional to the prospect, and in fact, in many cases, it took a mixture of persuasion and bribery to convince Ireland's MPs to pass the proposition. Very soon that coercion was not needed, as they became strong supporters of the United Kingdom. They had a religious and elements of a cultural kinship with their neighbours, but also very quickly saw the new union as benefiting them and their people economically, and they became Unionists. Ireland's Catholic population, however, bereft of the same ties and slower to develop economically, begrudged what they believed was unfair rule, and they would become known as nationalists. This resentment resulted in several further nationalist-inspired rebellions, eventually morphing into the campaign for Home Rule, the belief that all of Ireland should have its own government and be administered from within its own boundaries. The concept of Home Rule was anathema to Unionists, and opposition was fierce. Attempts to implement it via the first Home Rule Bill in 1886 and the second Home Rule Bill in 1893 both failed. But in doing so, the political division between Ulster and the rest of Ireland was once and for all clearly geographically delineated. Prior to this, Unionism was bonded together on an all-Ireland basis within an organisation called the Irish Loyal and Patriotic Union, then which became the Irish Unionist Alliance. Now, the most important and significant opposition numerically came in Ulster, and that opposition was organised on that territorial basis. The first mass membership Unionist movement in Ireland had been formed in 1893, the Ulster Defence Union, and at its height it had a membership that exceeded 170,000 men. Now, in the early 1900s, what is known as the Third Home Rule crisis began. Previous attempts to get Home Rule had failed. However, this time there was political support and leverage for the concept in Westminster, both from Irish nationalist MPs and counterparts on the mainland. The Austro-Unionist Council, bringing together all Unionists within the 9 counties, was formed in 1905. In response to Home Rule in 1912, the Protestants and Unionists in Ulster launched the Ulster Covenant, a massive petition to demonstrate the scale and strength of their opposition. And this was followed up, as we all know, by the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force. The 100,000 member organisation was organised on military lines to underline the commitment expressed in the Covenant that Home Rule would not be accepted. A rival Home Rule body, the Irish Volunteers, was formed across Ireland, and by July 1914 there was the real possibility of conflict between both of these groups. Now this abated whenever the Great War began in August 1914. Both Unionists and Nationalists enlisted into the British Army in large numbers to fight for the British Empire against Germany and its allies. The Home Rule Bill was passed in Parliament that September, but immediately moved into suspension due to the war. Now, during the Great War, some nationalists decided to take the opportunity of the United Kingdom's preoccupation to attempt yet another rebellion. The Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916 failed, but it created new tensions between Irish nationalism and Unionists. Many nationalists now wanted total independence from the United Kingdom as opposed to Home Rule. In the Unionist-dominated northeast of Ireland, Unionists were resolute and determined not to allow themselves to be taken out of the United Kingdom. In Dublin in 1917, an Irish convention was held. That was to bring together nationalists and Unionists to discuss Home Rule. However, its primary achievement was actually succeeding in bringing the exclusion of a part of Ireland into the conversation. Proposals to exclude all 9 counties of Ulster, 6 counties, or even just 4 of the most northeastern counties were all heard at this convention, and now were immovably embedded in the Unionist mindset. In the 1918 election, Unionists won the most seats in Ulster, but Sinn Féin won the majority of seats island-wide on a platform of abstentionism. Abstentionism being refusing to sit in the Westminster Parliament. In January 1919, they singularly declared Ireland to be an independent republic, and a sitting took place in Dublin of a provisional government. Now, concurrently, at the same time, these Republicans began the Anglo-Irish War, or sometimes called also the War of Independence. This would last over 2 years. It saw British and Unionist forces, people and symbols violently attacked, and became the backdrop to the decisions Unionists in Ulster would make regarding their future. On the 6th of June 1919, Carson put the proposal for a 6-county solution to Home Rule to the Ulster Unionist Council, urging their acceptance. A week later, Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan Unionists released their response that we protest in the strongest possible manner against the proposals of the government to revive the Home Rule controversy during the continuance of the war and during the absence of so many Covenanters serving His Majesty's forces. But if the 6 counties consider the safety of the Empire depends on the continuance of the negotiations on the basis suggested by the government, the responsibility must clearly be theirs, and the delegates of the 3 counties must abide by their decision. So the Ulster Unionist Council gratefully acknowledged this great sacrifice from the Southern Unionists. But from that point on, while they kept arguing their case, Calvin, Monaghan and Donegal Unionist organisation realised the writing was on the wall for their future in a petition to Ulster. In September 1919, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, initiated the Long Committee to decide how the government would undertake fulfilling its commitment to enact Home Rule. The outcome was a proposal to have two separate Home Rule jurisdictions. In February 1920, the Government of Ireland Act was introduced in Westminster, allowing for the short-term separate governing of the northeast of Ireland and the rest of the island, after which both would come together within an Irish Free State. It also, however, very importantly, outlined the right of either party to opt out and to autonomously retain their own self-governance, if at that stage they so wished. Now, preparations began in both areas towards creating the various structures required to administer their own civil service needs exclusively within their boundaries. The final last gasp of border unionists, of Calvin, Monaghan and Donegal, against being excluded from this new national entity in the northeast, came after that fourth Government of Ireland Act was introduced. And therein, within it, the sixth county, Northern Ireland, was proposed. In advance of the pivotal Ulster Unionist Council meeting of March to discuss this bill, the three border unionist bodies prepared and widely spread this leaflet espousing their cause, declaring that a 9-county Ulster had an in excess of a 200,000 Protestant majority. The document also thanked the Northern Unionists who were supportive of their position, in the process emotively evoking the memory of the Ulster Covenant. It also optimistically expressed the belief that the majority of Unionists were behind their cause. Now, despite a long list of resignations from the Ulster Unionist Council, because of the exclusion proposal of Calvin, Donegal and Monaghan, the Ulster Unionist Council delegates voted by 301 votes to 80 to accept it. Calvin Unionists reacted very angrily at first to the decision on a procedural level, claiming that they had not been given a fair hearing, but the anger really increased very quickly into real acrimony. Calvin Unionist leader Lord Farnham, a very, very prominent player in the Ulster volunteer movement, very much a hawk in the movement and a gun runner, he posed the question: how can the Ulster Covenant be broken simply for the interest of convenience? But the decision had already been made, and already disillusioned Unionist leaders in Calvin, Monaghan and Donegal became even more so, stepping aside from any political leadership roles within their communities, and minus leaders, the rank and file of border counties unionism was focusing primarily on protecting itself. On the 3rd of May 1921, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 was passed. This meant that Ireland was now partitioned, or divided. A border was defined dividing the 6 northeastern counties from the other 26, and Northern Ireland as a national entity in its own right officially came into existence. The first elections to a government for the new state, its own parliament, took place on the 24th of May 1921. And this parliament consisted of a House of Commons and a Senate. Unionists won 40 of the 52 seats available in its House of Commons, and they took all 24 seats in the Senate. 2 other seats were taken automatically by the Lord Mayors of Belfast and of Londonderry. The first Prime Minister was East Belfast's James Craig, son of a whisky distiller. Craig became a stockbroker after he left school, but abandoned that career to enlist in the Royal Irish Rifles and serve in the Great War and the Boer War. Upon his return from South Africa to Ireland, he devoted his life to politics. While MP for East Down, he was a hugely prominent personality within Austro-Unionism, and he was the main power behind rallying support for the Ulster Covenant and in organising the Ulster Volunteers. In February 1921, he became leader of the Austro-Unionists, taking over from Carson, and he was appointed Prime Minister on the 7th of June that year. And it was Craig who oversaw the official opening of the new Parliament. On the 22nd of June 1921, King George V and Queen Mary arrived in Belfast via the royal yacht to give their blessings to the new country and to its new institutions. At Donegal Quay, they mounted an open-top carriage and began a 4-mile journey to the centre of the city. The streets were unbrokenly thronged, not by thousands of people, but by tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. It is suggested that these were by far the largest crowds ever seen here, eclipsing even the annual massive 12th demonstrations. Special trains have been chartered from all corners of the province to bring spectators. It was not just an occasion for the city folk. Union flags were the accessory for the day, many people having simply made their own. Streets were bedecked with bunting, royal mottos and floral arches, as were the many impressive imposing buildings in the city centre. The banks, the stockbrokers, the accountants, each competed to see who could provide the most colourful and elaborate welcome for the monarch. For every stretch of their journey, the King and Queen were greeted with just rapturous applause and cheers. The Belfast newsletter later wrote of the occasion: "The people give themselves up a demonstration of loyalty and affection that must have touched the deepest feelings of their Majesties." And on the actual evening, while embarking back to England, the King and Queen sent a joint telegram to Craig, stating that they had been profoundly touched by the intense loyalty and enthusiasm with which they had been received. The Parliament, to be officially launched by royalty, would actually have its first permanent home at the Presbyterian Church of Ireland's Assembly College. So that's today's Union Theological College. And it met there from September 1921 to June 1932. But partially for symbolic purposes, partially for practical purposes, because of the scale of this event, it was formally opened at Belfast City Hall. As tens of thousands attempted to watch from any vantage point available, those who were deemed more important, including a body, in fairness, of 750 disabled soldiers, were seated on massive stands that housed over 2,200 people. After a delayed entrance into the city council chambers, the King mounted the throne and delivered his speech. Now, given the context of the events that had brought about the necessity for the occasion, the ongoing disturbances and violence both across the North East and the rest of Ireland, and the distinct animosity felt towards the monarchy by those pursuing a different political path in the south of Ireland, a reactionary and firm speech may have reasonably been predicted, but instead came an address very much of pacification. We'll just read a few lines from this. This is the King's speech. "This is a great and critical occasion in the history of the 6 counties, but not for the 6 counties alone. For everything which interests them touches Ireland, and everything which touches Ireland finds an echo in the remotest parts of the Empire. Few things are more earnestly desired throughout the English-speaking world than a satisfactory solution of the age-long Irish problems, which for generations embarrassed our forefathers as they now weigh heavily upon us. I speak a full heart when I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and to forget, and to join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill. May this historic gathering be the prelude of a day in which the Irish people, north and south, under one parliament or two, as those parliaments may themselves decide, shall work together in common love for Ireland upon the sure foundations of mutual justice and respect. Despite the King's words, the opening years of the young country were difficult. The terrorist campaign known as the Anglo-Irish War had begun in 1919 deep in the southwest, County Tipperary, and it saw the goal of the Irish Republican Army to remove all British presence in Ireland by force. By early 1920, in an attempt to disrupt the fledgling country, the IRA carnage had spread to Northern Ireland, and the number of violent incidents soon began to escalate. Unionists demanded control of security to protect their towns and hamlets, and to this end a new force had been formed in October 1920, the Ulster Espacio Constabulary. Now, despite the signing of a treaty between the UK government and the President of the new Irish Republic in December 1921, violence that had started way back had continued to June 1922. During that time, over 400 people were killed and several thousand wounded in violence related to the IRA attempt to destabilise what was the new Northern Ireland. These specials were the main barrier interrupting the ability of Republican operations. The IRA tactic of flying columns, small mobile groups coming into an area, then quickly fleeing after launching an attack, was largely foiled by the presence of Ulster Special Constabulary men patrolling on the ground. The IRA commander of its 3rd Northern Division admitted in later years that in 1922 it had been patrols of specials that forced him to continually abandon operations. Nearly all these Ulster Special patrols were uneventful, even boring, but the nature of the road meant it was a dangerous task. In the first few years of existence, some 72 lost their lives. The Ulster Special Constabulary were on the front line of this war and were directly responsible for defeating the IRA campaign. With calm returned, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, was formed in June 1922, took over the role of policing. The USC, better known as the B-Men, remained, but as a reserve force. Now, as per its prerogative, as detailed within the 1920 Act, on the 7th of December 1922, Northern Ireland implemented its right to remain separate from the rest of Ireland. And this was made by a declaration to the King. And this long-winded declaration, the Parliament stated to the King, "Most gracious Sovereign, we, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Senators and Commons of Northern Ireland and Parliament assembled, having learned of the passing of the Irish Free State Constitution Act, being the Act of Parliament for the ratification of Articles of Agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland, do, by this humble address, pray your Majesty that the powers of the Parliament and Government of the Irish Free State shall no longer extend to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland now stood in its own right. Within the December 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty, a treaty unionism had opposed, there was included a provision for a boundary commission. Now this body, this commission, was to examine the border areas of Northern Ireland and recommend were it deemed fitting if unionist areas, like some parts of North Monaghan or East Donegal, or nationalist areas like South Armagh or South Down, might be transferred into the jurisdiction that they deemed most communally appropriate. The expectation had been that a much larger part of Northern Ireland would be relinquished than would be gained. The response of unionism was very much typified by a slogan coined by Premier James Craig, "Not an inch." The commission was delayed by the civil war that had now begun in Southern Ireland as nationalism imploded, with different factions fighting each other over different visions of the future for the country and island. Despite many representations and recommendations, the Boundary Commission was overruled. Its report never published, and the existing boundaries, the 6 counties, determined to remain as Northern Ireland. Now, despite its challenging beginnings, Northern Ireland now settled down into a period of economic growth and relative calm. Differences that many perceived to have existed between its people and places and the rest of the island for thousands of years had now simply arrived at their logical conclusion. Northern Ireland, a country and a nation in its own right. Thank you.